Hi, hello. I'm John from Broadsheet. You're very welcome to the seventh series, or seventh show in a series of programs on the Mother and Baby Home Report, which was published last week. I'm joined again by adoptee and activist Eunan Duffy and Breeda Murphy, who's a Tuam campaigner. And Eunan, I'm going to go straight to you first because Northern Ireland was in the news this week in terms of the mother and baby homes. With a report which is in advance of an investigation, I guess. Eunan, can you describe what happened regarding Northern Ireland this week?
Yes, John. Good evening, evening, Breeda as
Evening,
well.
sorry, evening to both of you.
It's been an absolutely hectic week, and unfortunately, there's an absolute media frenzy right now just because of what's happened. And we would raise concerns about that because it's unfortunate actually that it takes an academic research or a commission's report before people start believing the victims and survivors. You know what I mean? It's these commissions and these reports that sort of validate what we've been trying to say for decades and in recent years especially. So yes, we eventually had an academic report that was published on Tuesday, nearly 18 months after it was handed into government. So some of the findings are, we would disagree with and we can contradict, but in many respects, it's put some, I suppose, quite stringent detail on. If you compare it to, for example, in the Commission's report, you know what I mean. There's a lot of qualitative and quantitative analysis. You know what I mean, actual stats and figures, and we have to remind people that. In terms of the persons involved, these are real life human beings, deceased and living. But yes, it can be compared and contrasted with the Commission's report. It's quite extensive, given its narrow terms of reference. It goes into a lot of detail about the adoptions and the adoption processes and their adoption findings. It puts in an adoption legislative framework of the decades and the 5 adoption acts there was in Northern Ireland from 1929. So it's pretty comprehensive in ways. It flags.
Eunan, did they publish this only because of the Irish, because of the report in Dublin being released? Why has it taken 18 months to publicise it?
Well, John, us cynical people would actually say that it was deliberately put back until the Irish Commission's report.
Yeah.
To be honest, it's given the absolutely inexcusable delays we've had, because as I say, it was handed in August 2019, and without an executive summary. So the academics and the Department of Health might blame each other as to why that didn't happen. We think it's completely amateurish and very remiss that it didn't happen, but it's been used as one of the delays in actually publicising the report. So that went on until the academics themselves actually did the executive summary only in February of last year. And the part of the problem there was that once the academics handed in the report in August 2019, they were effectively out of contract, which meant that they were under no contractual obligations to actually do the executive summary.
Okay.
I mean, it's shambolic in every respect. And then, of course, we had the blame of COVID, the moving around of personnel in the Department of Health. Then they were brought in this right to reply process, which was only brought in as an afterthought a year after it was handed in. And this was what they call a form of natural justice, where they give a right of reply to all of the institutions under scrutiny.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, even the actual victims and survivors that took part in the research didn't get that natural justice. They weren't given any right to reply to actually see the report until 24 hours before it was actually published. So on the back of that, John, actually as well, I think it's important to say that there was an absolute furore in the Republic of Ireland a few days before the Commission's report was published, in terms of a leak that came from government and content within that report, despite the fact that victims and survivors were given stringent assurances that they would be the first to see sight of it. And the Republic's government actually said there would be an investigation as to see what happened to that. And we had the exact same thing happened in the north a week later.
Wow.
Only we know who leaked the information.
Oh,
So,
dear.
yes.
Okay.
And it was the chairperson of the working group established to look into the mother and baby institutions and the Magdalene laundries. Who in an email.
The person from Queens, is it? Or, like, is it?
No, this was the actual chairperson. This is the third chairperson we've had from this whole process started. And she was the deputy chief constable of the PSNI before she retired in 2014. So she replied to an email from an ordinary member of the public on the back of concerns of what had been given out in the Commission's report the week before about medical trials. So she had contacted the chairperson of the group and said, I'm worried about my brother who was in an institution in the north. Is there any chance he might have been subjected to medical trials? So in her wisdom, the chairperson of the group actually decided to say, oh, no, he wasn't, because the research report that's coming out next week has established that there's no evidence of medical trials that went on in the north between 1922 and 1999. So the woman who sent the email to the chairperson actually went straight to the Irish News and disclosed 4 findings from the report. So I've tried to flag that up at the meeting we had on Tuesday. There was all sorts of a mutual appreciation society between the First Minister, Deputy First Minister, and the chairperson of the group, who lauded everybody involved for saying that there was no leaks of the report before it came out.
What happened on the View? What happened on the View last night? Is that on BBC Northern Ireland? Is it?
Yes, it'll be on. The View is a regular programme basically where they go on the analyse and scrutinise and get various people on to talk about the current issues of the time. So Archbishop Eamon Martin was he appeared on the View last night. And in the opening statement by the presenter, he actually said that in light of what had been happening this week, that there was a consultation process beginning tonight, and we were completely unaware of it. I rang the Department of Health today and asked them, what's this consultation process tonight, because we know nothing about it, given all the assurances and the sound bites we'd heard over the last week, that we would be involved in every part of the process going forward.
Victim-centred investigation.
Oh yes, victim-centred, victim-focused. Everything would be framed by victims and survivors. And here we are.
And
the Department of Health today.
What did they say?
The Department of Health today knew nothing about it. Absolutely nothing about it. And this was put out on a BBC programme last night.
And where did they get it from?
We don't know. I rang them and I said to them, can you check out where this has come from? I says, because none of us that are involved, the actual victims and survivors and advocates, know anything about this. And the girl in the department says to me, well, we don't know either. The actual interdepartmental working group is definitely not involved. So maybe it's higher up in government. But, we know nothing. You would like to think that on an established programme like that, he has made that statement based on some kind of a fact that he's got from somewhere. But we don't know, John.
And Marion Vale is in Uri, where you were born. That was mentioned in the report. Did it give any detail that you were unaware of, or?
Well, look, we would be aware of most of the issues. Basically, these guys made some substantial findings, give us a lot of figures, dates, etc., about various things. And that would include the cross-border movement of women and babies. There's figures like, let me see, 630 in Moyenville in the 1960s. Admissions were direct to the hospitals, and women came back from the hospitals following prenatal a prenatal period in the Good Shepherd in Moyenville. I'd say that admissions would only be made following examinations by medical officer attached to the home, which is interesting.
Yeah.
The girls and the women range from age 14 until their 40s. And 74% of those that entered, it was around 1,030 people, according to the records that they were given, entered while pregnant and returned to Morganville immediately after birth, usually from the nearby Daisy Hill Hospital. But it's interesting that they're saying that virtually most of these mothers and their babies were returned to Morganville on the same day that they were given birth to the babies. And I have read various medical reports that say, including the issues around infant mortality rates, this would include that basically this would be one reason why babies would potentially inadvertently die if brought back from a hospital far, far too soon after the birth of the baby. So again, this would be another issue that would...
Yeah, I mean, would the mother be separated then from the baby at that stage? Or Breeda, perhaps you can...
Yeah, similar for Tuam, for the children that were born in the Central Hospital in Galway, which is now University College Hospital. Women would have been sent to Tuam if the child was kept for a period of time thereafter. The difficulty is, and we're looking at the moment for a baptismal certificate for a child who's one of a twin born to a mother in Tuam, well, born in the Central Hospital, but had come from the Tuam home in 1935, and one of the twins, one of the little girls, died. But trying to find where the remains of that child is at times really difficult, because the reality is the hospital itself had it brought the child at times. The remains may have been in the Bohermore Cemetery in the pauper's grave. They may have been given to the porter, or the porter may have taken them, taken the remains across the road to the university anatomy department. Unlikely that the child's remains would have gone back to Tuam, but it's very, very difficult to know. Trying to find out this, so long after such a time. You're dealing as well with church authorities who regularly keep very good notes on certainly baptisms. And I learned only today that any child baptized in the hospital, they actually keep the records for the baptismal records. They keep them in the hospital at the moment, in University College Hospital, Galway. I wouldn't have thought that, John. So that's news to me. I would have thought they would have gone either to the parish of where the mother came from, or to the diocesan office.
That's so. Have those records been looked at in terms of Tuam?
I think
have those records been looked at in terms of Tuam? The
various
hospital?
Records. Yeah. That's what we're trying to see at the moment, to get those records, to see what we can find out about children who passed away in the Central Hospital and where those remains went, John, particularly if they were very, very young children. If they had not actually left the hospital for the Tuam home, would those remains be in a mass grave site in Bohermore Cemetery in Galway, or would they be in the anatomy department and brought across in 1935?
Yeah,
it's difficult to know.
And the children who survived, then would the mother go with the child back to the home in Newry? Like, would that be the procedure where they go to the hospital, have the child, and then bring the child, or would they be separated from the child at the hospital?
Well, in many cases, the women did go back with their babies. It was only then that in a lot of cases, actually, the baby would have been separated from the mother and put into the nursery immediately. So the mother would have had very little to no care of the baby itself, because obviously we're aware from testimonies and facts, in my own case especially, where the baby separated from the mother, and they're basically placed on a list to be adopted, and again, this comes into the whole commodifying aspect that comes into eugenics, etc., because babies were basically placed on was virtually a supermarket floor, and the adoptive parents would have been coming in, looking at them and picking which baby they wanted, depending on how they looked, etc. Any children that had any sort of a marking or a deformity or anything, obviously would have been, basically categorized as unadoptable then. And of course, then we could look into the equations as what actually happened to some of these babies there, because these babies were never reconnected with their birth mothers. So were they in fact, given the the astronomical numbers we have in terms of babies that died and infant mortality rates and the burials, etc., etc. So were these babies then the babies that were basically neglected and starved to death? So again, these are issues that, you know, we need quantified, you know what I mean, and immediately as well, you know.
Sorry, Eunan, I don't want to, didn't mean to interrupt. Just with the mother and the child, if they're separated, there's no breastfeeding, there's no nurturing or anything like that. So the separation happens as soon as it can happen. Is that what?
Oh yes, look, it's as cold and clinical as that separation. You know what I mean? And again, you know, the sustenance, the nutrition, everything that a baby would get from a mother's breast milk, obviously has been denied, and that again would contribute, given, you know, the farther we go back in history, that again would contribute to the life expectancy of the child as well. You know, so these are all major considerations. We know for a fact, John, that a number of women that had their babies actually taken off them, and that includes physically ripped out of their hands, creating absolute hysteria for some of these women.
Yeah.
But some of these women that stayed on then for a number of days, weeks, and months later, they were then basically forced to go into the nursery then and look after other women's children, which I find absolutely deplorable. It must be unimaginable pain for a birth mother to have to do that.
Yeah, it's incredibly upsetting. Breeda, and the same, I suppose, I was impressed by Arlene Foster just in the language, the strength of the language, but again, it's the same old rhetoric, isn't it? The victim-centered report, you know, investigation, victim-focused, victim-led. Victim-led, yeah. Breeda, your thoughts on the North, the similarities between that and the South?
When I got the report, I read through just the initial part of it, and I said to Eunan, I was impressed by the way that it flowed. It's like a narrative that at least you can read compared to the Commission's report. I mean, there's such disconnection from the executive summary to the survivor testimonies in the Commission's report. And when you read it, it's so poorly put together that it's difficult to really grasp what they're trying to say. And then you go back to it again, because all the time it's a deflection exercise, deflecting all the time from and placing the blame back on the victim survivor. And, you know, talking about the little children, I was watching the adoption stories, which Sharon Lawless does the other night. And there were two Irish children who were adopted to the United States to a really good family in 1960. And the little boy had never wanted to really find out his background, because he felt, as many do, that it was wrong to do so while his adopted parents, who to all intents and purposes, he felt were his parents. So he really didn't want to go down that road until they had passed away. But ultimately he did, and he went to the home that he was adopted from in Dublin. And prior to that, he actually remembered, he's only 2, he remembered as a little child on the floor with a group of other children and 3 adults, his mom and dad from America, and possibly the nun, looking at him. And he remembered the other children, he remembered what the floor, the decor was like. I mean, amazing for a 2-year-old, and he carried that memory. But he was so taken by it, and at the time coming back to Ireland at the age of 60 or whatever, he said that he wished he had done this journey previously, because he had found out family history that he was left without. But the first 1,000 days of a child's life from a psychological perspective are incredibly important. A child at that stage is like a sponge. It is literally, and it needs the nurturing environment. Empathy and all of those traits are developed at that time. So the children from the very first moment were removed from their mother. The mother was not encouraged to feed her own child. Sometimes child was passed around, and breastfeeding was frowned upon more than encouraged at the time. So I think
wet mothers or anything like that. It was simply,
yeah, just I think it was more, you know, the nuns that were looking after them. And there was, you have to remember, there were the vaccine trials, but there were also the milk trials at the time. So it was milk formula trials that were being you know, tried out. Yeah, so, you know, I think we really have to challenge the Commission's report. And the great thing is, in the last week, there are many voices, strong voices coming together, many survivors who, and adoptees and mothers first, who had been in these homes, who are now out in force to say this does not represent the stories we told you. And thankfully, politicians from all parties are on board. I held a Zoom call this evening with one for about 2 hours, and they're really committed to hearing from the commissioners, which must happen. Judge Breeda Murphy has to come into the Dáil, to the Oireachtas Committee. An invitation has been extended. Sorry. To
sorry, it's confusing. Sorry, this is the article about Holly Cairns' question to the Taoiseach during this week, and
she's fantastic.
She was fantastic. This is Breeda, you sent me this. Under the Coroner's Act, it is the duty of a coroner to hold an inquest when a body is found, and he said, will the Taoiseach ensure that coroners carry out their duty to ensure that survivors get justice? She writes that there's a legal obligation for inquests to be carried out for each of the deceased individual. We know this relates to a large number of coroners in every relevant district and would be unprecedented in the use of resources, but there is a legal obligation. The Taoiseach replied, I will make further inquiries in this. There are clearly legal obligations, but that in itself is an enormous challenge going back to the early decades of the state, from the 20s, 30s and 40s. The 40s in particular saw an appallingly high infant rate mortality in mother and baby homes. The Minister for Children is developing a broad-based response to the Commission report. How to deal with this will form part of it. So not really a definitive answer there, but very interesting that it was raised, because a lot of groups and survivors have raised this. That why aren't the guards just being called? I mean, if you know, if you found a grave, you would call the police, right?
Absolutely. From the moment that the remains of the children were dated to 1950, to the time when the home was operated, one would have thought right then the site would be preserved pending a full excavation. But that wasn't done, John. And I think the report now follows the line. If you know the way the government drip feed little pieces of information, well, they've been doing this through the Commission's report as well, because there was a time when they said, you know, continuing down this path will lead to a breakdown between church and wider society and church and state. That had no place in any interim report. It also said at one time that there was no findings of neglect or abuse within the homes. Now that's carried through to the final report, but we were assured some years ago that it would be properly constructed and investigated for the final report. And when you get a survivor telling you, be they a mother or an adoptee or a fostered out child, telling you of their hearing loss due to being pulled and dragged in the home, then either you believe or disbelieve them. So currently it appears like the Commission does not believe the survivor testimonies, and that's the most hurtful part of this. But you know, in 1973, the Kennedy report was spoken of in the Oireachtas by none other than Mary Robinson at the time. And again, it was the same narrow remit. It was already the answers were predetermined before the study took place. And it was an exercise in taking away material that would otherwise substantiate much of what survivors say today, because that material is sealed for 30 years. You know, so look, John.
With the contributions this week in the Senate, you touched on it briefly. There's a real political will now, isn't there, that to reject the findings of this report and to demand a lot more.
Yeah, some have called for an independent review, and some have called for the commissioners to come in, the three parties to the commission, to come in to the Oireachtas to answer questions posed by advocates and adoptees particularly, and boarded out children and families and the mothers who would have questions, to put them directly to them through the medium maybe of, you know, technologies and Zoom and whatever. And I think that's a really good thing, because you cannot, as Lisa Chambers, she was pretty strong in the channel, to say that, you know, they have been paid good money for this report, and why not come before us and explain? And you have to remember, she is a legal expert too, she's a barrister, so she understands the reason for needing to have, yeah, that's Alice Mary Higgins, and Senator O'Reilly, and Gerard Crowell was strong on in relation to the communities at home and how women were treated in Irish society because of the overwhelming power of church and state, and that's played down in the report.
Okay, can I use a quote from Lisa Chambers here, Breeda? I reiterate my call that the commissioners involved in preparing this report should take questions from survivors, the public and the media. They are not in isolation, they are publicly known. Now, we know who they are, they were paid well for their work, they were given ample time to complete their work. And isn't it time we had a chat with them?
Yeah, absolutely.
Very strong, and I can't see how they can ignore these speeches and the work that Eunan has done and you've done and survivors groups. I just don't think they could ignore it. No,
and it's public money, John. It's public money. It's our money that paid. You know, the commission was provided with. They only spent 11.5 million, but they have another 11.5 million in the pot. So if they really wanted to do a proper job on this, they could have done. I think that it's a shame that after all the reports we've had, we're still, or the state is still deflecting, still blaming the victim survivor, very much so, or blaming wider society. And unfortunately too, fathers have got a really bad time on this, because, and there are and were always good fathers who wanted to stand by the girls, some who married the girls and could not get the child back. Some, when their lover came out, they got married, they tried to get the child back, it didn't work. You know, there've been so many people disrespected in this, and demonizing men is just another tragedy to the story.
Help us with this. The argument is that it is society, and the men are getting off lightly. What about the families? In your experience with survivors, are those stories common, or is the majority of the stories a simple pregnancy, like not involving incest, not abuse, not rape? I mean, but how common is the story that you put forward, as opposed to the one that the people trying to blame society put forward? Eunan, Breeda, I hope it's not too difficult a question.
No, it's fine. Look, this has been the vitriolic narrative that's came from the Commission's report in the South, and it's been trotted out in the academic research report as well, unfortunately. And Archbishop Eunan Martin, in his apology last night, was laden with these issues as well. So it was basically it's like trying to say that society itself was like some kind of a separate entity from religious ideology, and that religious ideology had absolutely no effect or influence on society. I mean, it's insulting to people's intelligence to actually say that this was society's fault, you know what I mean, without any kind of indoctrination from religious ideology. It's absolutely ludicrous. And Eunan Martin touched on these things last night in his apology, where he was saying, you know, well, it wasn't just us. there was plenty of other people involved too. And he talked about GPs and solicitors and private adoption agencies. It was like, woe is me, don't just coming after us. Like, there was a lot of other people involved too. He talked about the non-Christian countries having these mother and baby institutions as well, you know, and they behave just as bad. So it was like, I know we were bad, but plenty of other people were doing it too, regardless of religion. I mean, it's a complete cop-out, John, you know.
And also the nuns were victims too, and I mean, you got to hand it to them. They're creative in the sense that their defenses, you know, nuns were victims too, in the sense what, like mothers or the babies, or you know, they were.
Yeah, well, you know, it's been something that's been. It's also part of the current narrative as well, and the way it's been trotted out to the public is that, you know, we're talking about misogyny and patriarchy as if it's a thing of the past. You know, that there was a line drawn somewhere. This is all stopped. We're now in a better place. But of course, everybody knows that has been only very, very partially remedied, and it's still highly prevalent in society. So, you know, we have to take this all into context. You know what I mean? These people like Archbishop Martin, you know what I mean, can put out all of these sort of spurious sort of statements and hope that people don't analyze them and break them down and say, no, actually, we can challenge this here. There are major issues that you're talking about. And of course, you know, some people would say it can be argued that religion is the perfect business model because it manufactures the problem. It sees the gap in the market and a market in the gap, and then it sells you the cure.
Yeah.
You know, and I've said this for a long time. Eunan Martin was talking last night about authoritarianism and judgmentalism and how things were in society and all. You know, well, it's all been cited. You know, it's that the state allowed religions the state basically allowed religion to run the immoral crusade whilst abdicating its responsibility to its citizens, and still both, you know, creating. We were all in it together. We all did it. You know what I mean? Me, you, and Breeda didn't do it. You know, it's an absolute disgrace that they're trying to put the blame on everybody, only themselves. You know what I mean? Where's the accountability here? It's
No. There was sense, and there's another aspect, like you say. You know, they've rendered us kind of almost childlike in terms of the church, in a sense, so innocent and you know, unworldly. That left us in that, you know. We emerged as adults, very childlike in that environment.
Well, Eunan Martin mentioned last night. There were Mark Carruthers talked about the moral tone that there was, and Eunan Martin said about, oh, we're now absolutely scandalised. They're scandalised because they've been scandalised for years, and now they've been actually rumbled yet again. This is not yet another massive scandal. You know, we're effectively talking, as you were talking a few minutes ago there, about, you know, where's the criminal prosecutions here? These were crimes against humanity.
Yeah.
Some of the most serious, grievous, heinous crimes that you could think of that have been carried out on our doorsteps in the 32 counties of Ireland. I mean, it's, you know, Marionville actually shows that there was one woman from Holland in Marionville.
Really?
There was 47 women from Britain. You know, if you don't mind, I'll go over very, very briefly some extracts from the report. And
we have 3 minutes left,
so
the floor is yours. We have 3 minutes left, but the floor is yours.
All right, sorry.
No.
Right, let me see. I'll try and make it quick.
There was a woman from Holland, and you said it was 40 odd women from the UK as well.
47 women from Britain, so that included England and Scotland. Where's this here? Yeah, it said the Good Shepherd sisters, 2 Good Shepherd sisters, said that social workers made all the adoption decisions. So basically, when an adoption was considered, that they brought social workers in to do this. But the report says that there's clear correspondence sent to Marionville that shows close involvement with the adoption process in a high number of cases. So completely contradicts the things that they were saying. There were 72 Marionville babies moved to Stamullen in County Meath and adopted in the Republic of Ireland. 21 Marionville babies were adopted in the Republic of Ireland, where there's absolutely no record of involvement of any agency or any institution.
Just trafficked.
just completely trafficked. You know, and there's a letter, they cite a letter in page 77 from the Catholic Protection and Rescue Society of Ireland in 1972 to one nun, raising concerns about Marionville placing a child in Dundalk, and said that it would be in breach of law to do so. And the Catholic Protection and Rescue Society advised the nun to let the child's mother transport the child, assuming that that would actually make it legal, so that the parent would accompany the child across the border, and that would make everything all right. I mean, it's absolutely staggered. There's and the reporters say that there was a high number of transatlantic adoptions, basically, that were facilitated by a short stay in Stamullen as well. So if that doesn't tell you what was going on cross border, nothing will, you know.
Let's have a look at that next week. I've written to Holly Cairns and Catherine Connolly, so hopefully we'll get them on at some point, maybe next week, and go through some of the more details. Breeda Murphy and Eunan Duffy, thank you so much. Really an amazing time, really, isn't it, for this stuff, for survivors groups, for victims. It's some movement anyway, isn't it?
Well, let's hope that Arlene Foster can't dither away from her saying that public inquiry is not wanted by all victims and survivors so far. So let's see what happens.
Yeah, and Breeda.
Yeah, and I was just going to say, it's great to have this forum, John, because what is happening is that the media are beginning to close